In the age before betrayal was whispered among the stars, before brother raised blade against brother, there was only expansion. It was an era remembered in fragments and half-lit chronicles, a time when humanity stepped outward from the cradle of old Earth and declared the galaxy its inheritance. Across a million worlds scattered through cold and hostile void, the species that had once nearly destroyed itself rose with renewed certainty. The banners of the Imperium did not yet bear the scars of civil war. They moved forward in unity, guided by a single will whose presence shaped the destiny of all. At the center of that will stood the Emperor. He was not merely a sovereign in the common understanding of the word. He was architect, conqueror, philosopher, and warlord, a being whose origins were cloaked in antiquity and whose ambitions extended beyond any mortal horizon. Upon Terra, beneath the shadow of vast palaces and impossible fortifications, he forged the foundations of a new dominion. From the ashes of fractured nations and techno-barbarian tyrannies, he constructed a unified world, and from that unified world, he prepared to reclaim the stars. The Great Crusade began not as a simple campaign of war, but as a reclamation. For millennia, humanity had been scattered by storms in the warp, the roiling, unnatural dimension through which faster-than-light travel was made possible. Entire colonies were lost to isolation. Some fell to anarchy. Others developed along strange and divergent paths. Many forgot their origins entirely. When the storms abated and the pathways of the Imperium grew navigable once more, the Emperor judged that the time had come to gather his lost children. And so the fleets departed. They moved in ordered formations of silver and gold, their hulls bearing the sigils of a reborn Imperium. Vast expeditionary armadas translated from the warp into unexplored systems, bringing with them compliance or conquest. Where human civilizations endured, emissaries spoke of unity and shared destiny. Where resistance rose, it was met with disciplined force. At the forefront of these fleets marched the legions of stars, the Space Marines. They were not common soldiers. They were transhuman creations, shaped through gene science and relentless training into living weapons of impossible endurance. Each legion bore distinct heraldry and traditions, yet all shared a singular purpose: to secure humanity's dominion among the stars. They descended from orbit in thunderous drops, their armored forms striking like meteors into the heart of battle. Against alien empires and human tyrants alike, they prevailed. Yet even among these warriors, there were figures of greater renown. The Primarchs. Scattered in infancy across the galaxy by forces unseen, these superhuman sons of the Emperor were rediscovered one by one as the Crusade advanced. Each was a master of war and governance, a being whose presence transformed entire campaigns. When reunited with their legions, they inspired loyalty beyond measure. Under their command, victories multiplied. Systems fell into compliance with increasing speed. In those early decades, optimism flowed like a rising tide. World after world accepted the imperial truth, a doctrine that denied superstition and sought to free humanity from the chains of Fae. Temples were dismantled. Ancient cults were dissolved. In their place came rationality, science, and the promise of unity under enlightened rule. The Emperor did not demand worship. He demanded progress. Across the breadth of conquered space, infrastructure followed conquest. Shipyards bloomed in orbit around compliant planets. Roads of adamantium and ferrocrete spanned continents. Astropathic choirs stitched distant systems together with fragile strands of psychic communication. Humanity, long fractured, began to feel whole. And always, the Emperor remained both present and distant. He walked among his generals in the early years, lending his insight to strategy and his power to decisive battles. It was said that when he strode upon a battlefield, the air itself seemed to bend in acknowledgement. Enemies faltered. Allies stood taller. His golden armor gleamed not merely as ornament, but as symbol, a beacon of authority unchallenged. Yet even as the crusade expanded, he withdrew more frequently to Terra. There were works to oversee, plans to lay that stretched far beyond immediate conquest. The governance of an interstellar empire demanded structure, and so councils were formed, administrations codified, and the machinery of bureaucracy set into motion. The Imperium was becoming more than a campaign. It was becoming permanence. Among the Primarchs, one in particular embodied the Crusade's fierce momentum. He was a warrior shaped by hardship, raised upon a brutal world where survival demanded strength and decisiveness. When reunited with his legion, he transformed it into an instrument of relentless efficiency. His campaigns were swift, calculated, and devastating. Compliance followed in his wake not through chaos, but through precision. To his brothers, he was both rival and exemplar. To his warriors, he was a living standard by which all were measured. He believed utterly in the Emperor's vision. Under his command, expeditionary fleets pushed ever farther into the unknown. They encountered civilizations that had adapted to isolation in strange ways. Some greeted the Imperium as saviors, welcoming reunion with ancestral kin. Others resisted with desperation born of pride or fear. In each case, the outcome was inevitable. Humanity would be united. There was a sense, in those days, that history itself had turned a corner. The darkness that had once engulfed mankind seemed to recede before disciplined light. Explorators of the Mechanicum uncovered lost technologies and restored ancient marvels. Agricultural worlds were terraformed to feed distant populations. Trade routes stabilized entire sectors. It was not merely conquest, it was construction. And yet, beneath the confidence, subtle tensions lingered. The Imperium expanded at a pace few could fully comprehend. Communication across its vast breadth remained imperfect. Warp travel, though navigable, was never entirely predictable. Expeditionary forces operated months or years apart, relying on faith in shared doctrine and loyalty to command. The Emperor's absence from the front lines grew more pronounced as his responsibilities multiplied. In his stead, war masters and high commanders bore increasing authority. The machinery of empire required delegation. Decisions that once flowed directly from Terra now passed through layers of command. The warrior who carried the Emperor's last hope, though none would have described him in such terms at the time, stood at the heart of this evolving structure. He was entrusted with responsibilities that extended beyond battlefield triumphs. He was confidant, strategist, and exemplar of imperial unity. In council chambers carved from conquered stone, he spoke of destiny. On war-torn plains beneath alien skies, he demonstrated it. His presence reassured those who doubted. His victories silenced critics. He carried, upon his broad shoulders, not only the expectations of his legion but the confidence of an entire crusading civilization. And still, the stars stretched onward. Every system brought into compliance revealed dozens more beyond. Charts of explored space expanded in spirals of ink and luminescent data. Astropaths sang of distant signals yet to be investigated. Rumors of ancient Xenos realms drifted through fleet channels, spoken in measured tones by navigators who had glimpsed impossible structures in the void. The Imperium's unity was strong, but it was not yet tested by its own magnitude. In quiet moments between campaigns, when the engines of vast flagships hummed with steady vibration and the warp lay calm beyond armored hulls, there were reflections. The Primarchs would stand before observation galleries, gazing into the endless field of stars. Each point of light represented a challenge, a promise, or a memory. He believed, as all his brothers did, that their father's design was flawless. They would bring reason to chaos. They would secure a future where humanity stood unchallenged. They would complete the Great Crusade. In those early years, doubt had little space to root. Success bred certainty. Certainty bred ambition. And ambition propelled fleets ever forward, deeper into territories unclaimed. Yet history, though silent, was not idle. For every triumph recorded in illuminated script, unseen currents stirred within the warp. For every oath sworn in loyalty, shadows lengthened in distant corners of thought. The Imperium was vast, but the galaxy was vaster still. And so Chapter 1 of this age closed not with defeat, nor with warning, but with momentum. The fleets advanced. The Emperor labored upon Terra, distant yet vigilant. The warrior who bore his trust continued to conquer in his name, unaware of the weight that destiny would one day place upon his soul. Across the endless night, humanity shone brightly, a constellation of reclaimed worlds bound together by faith in reason and the promise of unity. For now, that light burned steady, and in the quiet between heartbeats of empire, beneath the soft hum of voidship engines and the distant murmur of astropathic choirs, the dream of a united mankind drifted peacefully among the stars, waiting for the next dawn. As the Great Crusade advanced deeper into uncharted territories, the nature of command began to change. Victory was no longer measured solely by the fall of hostile citadels or the surrender of isolated regimes. It was measured in systems stabilized, in cultures reshaped, in the steady weaving together of distant worlds into a coherent whole. The Imperium was no longer a blazing spear thrust outward from Terra. It was becoming a vast and intricate structure, one that demanded vigilance as much as aggression. In this evolving order, the Emperor's presence grew increasingly remote. His withdrawal to Terra was not an abandonment of the Crusade, but a transformation of his role within it. Reports flowed constantly toward the throne world, data slate transmissions, astropathic choirs singing encoded victories and setbacks, strategic assessments composed in the austere language of military logic. Yet the Emperor himself was seldom seen beyond the solar system. His attention was fixed upon undertakings of profound secrecy, projects that required focus beyond the tumult of frontline warfare. In his absence, authority consolidated elsewhere. Among the Primarchs, one had risen to singular prominence. His campaigns had been marked by discipline rather than recklessness, by unity rather than rivalry. Where others pursued glory in dramatic engagements, he cultivated stability. Where resistance proved stubborn, he applied force with calculated restraint, ensuring that compliance would endure beyond the immediate surrender. It was not simply martial prowess that distinguished him. It was reliability. He became the voice through which the Emperor's broader intent was interpreted to distant commanders. When disputes arose between expeditionary fleets, his judgment carried decisive weight. When uncertainty clouded the purpose of a campaign, his counsel restored clarity. Gradually, without proclamation or ceremony, he bore a responsibility that extended far beyond his legion. The Imperium trusted him. In the quiet halls of flagship strategiums, beneath vaulted ceilings illuminated by starlight refracted through armored glass, he studied the expanding maps of conquered space. Each new compliance added lines of supply, corridors of travel, and obligations of governance. He understood that conquest was transient unless followed by structure. A world brought to heel must be guided into stability, its resources integrated, its population aligned with imperial doctrine. He spoke often of unity, not merely as an abstract principle, but as a necessity for survival. Humanity had endured centuries of fragmentation. The warp storms that once isolated its colonies were unpredictable. Their return could not be discounted. Alien powers observed the Imperium's expansion with growing awareness. To fracture now would invite annihilation later. And so he cultivated loyalty not only within his legion, but across the broader command hierarchy. He fostered cooperation between the legion's astartes and the Imperial army. He ensured that Mechanicum detachments received the protection and respect necessary to recover ancient technologies. He encouraged remembrances and chroniclers to record the Crusade's progress, believing that shared narrative strengthened shared purpose. Yet even as he labored to reinforce cohesion, subtle signs of strain appeared. The Primarchs were creations of immense individuality. Each possessed distinct temperament, philosophy, and method. While united in allegiance to their father, they were not identical in outlook. Rivalries, one sharpened solely by competition for battlefield distinction, began to acquire more complex edges. Questions of precedence, of strategic direction, of interpretation of the imperial truth surfaced in councils. Most disagreements resolved swiftly. The authority of the emperor remained unquestioned, and loyalty to him overrode personal ambition. Still, the sheer scale of the crusade magnified every divergence. The warrior at its center recognized this. He approached his brothers not as adversaries, but as components of a greater design. He sought consensus where possible and decisive action where necessary. To some, his moderation appeared caution. To others, it signaled strength. He carried himself with composure, even as the weight of expectation increased. On the battlefield, however, composure gave way to ferocity. There were campaigns during this period that tested the Imperium's resolve. Human civilizations that had evolved in isolation sometimes embraced ideologies antithetical to imperial doctrine. Certain Xenos empires wielded technologies equal or superior to those of the Mechanicum. War zones stretched across continents and into orbit, fleets clashing in void engagements that illuminated entire systems with atomic fire. In one such campaign, compliance required not only tactical brilliance but moral clarity. A human regime, steeped in rigid dogma and fortified by formidable defenses, rejected reunion with terror. They viewed the Imperium not as salvation, but as conquest. Negotiations faltered. Skirmishes escalated. The decision to unleash full force was not taken lightly. He weighed the cost of devastation against the imperative of unity. Ultimately, he concluded that a fractured humanity posed a greater threat than the destruction of a single obstinate regime. His legion descended with disciplined precision. Orbital bombardments targeted military installations with minimal collateral devastation. Ground assaults neutralized resistance centers in coordinated strikes. Within weeks, the planet stood compliant. In the aftermath, reconstruction began immediately. Administrators were appointed, infrastructure repaired, the populace introduced to the broader narrative of humanity's resurgence. The memory of resistance faded beneath tangible improvements in stability and prosperity. Such campaigns reinforced his reputation. He was not reckless. He was resolute. As his influence expanded, so too did his introspection. In moments of solitude, he contemplated the emperor's silence. He understood that the throne-world projects must be of immense importance, yet he could not entirely dismiss a subtle unease. The crusade had always been a shared endeavor, father and sons advancing together. Now, distance defined their relationship. Still, his faith remained unshaken. He interpreted the emperor's withdrawal as trust. A sovereign confident in his design could afford delegation. The crusade's momentum testified to that confidence. Systems continued to fall into compliance at accelerating pace. New Primarchs were rediscovered, each reunion strengthening the Imperium's martial capacity. The galaxy seemed finite before such determination. And yet, beyond the edges of mapped space, anomalies persisted. Reports filtered through extrapathic channels of strange phenomena within the warp. Fluctuations not severe enough to halt travel, but sufficient to unsettle experienced navigators. Occasional expeditions vanished without clear explanation. Such losses were attributed to the inherent dangers of interstellar expansion, recorded with solemnity and filed among acceptable risks. The Imperium pressed onward regardless. Confidence remained its defining trait. The Emperor's vision guided policy. The Primarchs embodied that vision in action. The legions executed it with unwavering discipline. Humanity's resurgence appeared inevitable, ordained by strength and reason alike. At the heart of it all stood the warrior entrusted with extraordinary authority. He did not perceive himself as savior or last hope. He saw only duty, an obligation to fulfill his father's intent and safeguard the unity so painstakingly forged. If doubts flickered at the edges of thought, he mastered them as he mastered every battlefield. For now, the crusade endured in triumph. The stars ahead were countless. The Imperium's banners advanced steadily toward them, and in the measured cadence of conquest and consolidation, the burden of command settled ever more firmly upon his shoulders, shaping him into something greater than a general, yet not yet aware of the trials that destiny would demand. In the expanding sphere of imperial dominion, distance became both ally and adversary. With each system brought into compliance, the Imperium's borders extended farther from Terra, stretching supply lines across sectors once untouched by human governance. Expeditionary fleets operated months apart, sometimes years, relying upon the fragile lattice of extrapathic communication to maintain cohesion. Messages traveled not as simple signals, but as psychic impressions cast into the shifting tides of the warp, received and interpreted by trained minds whose endurance was as vital as any warship's armor. It was an imperfect system. Delays were common. Transmissions arrived distorted, fragmented by immaterial turbulence. Clarifications required patience. In such an environment, autonomy was not merely practical, it was essential. Commanders learned to act without awaiting confirmation. Primarchs interpreted the Emperor's will through their own understanding of his design. The warrior entrusted with supreme operational authority adapted to this reality with measured resolve. He reorganized fleet structures to enhance mutual support between distant expeditions. He standardized compliance protocols to reduce ambiguity in governance. He encouraged collaboration between legions that had once competed for distinction, fostering interdependence rather than rivalry. His intention was simple, to ensure that, even in silence, the Imperium spoke with one voice. Yet silence carried weight. There were stretches of time when no word came from Terra, not because disaster had struck, but because the Emperor's focus lay elsewhere. Rumors circulated quietly among officers and remembrancers, speculations regarding monumental works beneath the imperial palace, endeavors of arcane science or strategic necessity. None questioned the Emperor's purpose. Still, absence created space for contemplation. Among the Primarchs, contemplation took different forms. Some embraced increased independence, pursuing campaigns according to personal philosophy. Others sought ever greater feats of conquest, as though to reaffirm their indispensability. The bonds of brotherhood endured, but subtle variations in perspective deepened. The Imperium was vast enough to accommodate many interpretations of its mission, yet unity required careful tending. The warrior observed these currents without public comment. He understood that strength of character defined his brothers as surely as genetic design. To suppress individuality entirely would undermine the very excellence the Emperor had cultivated. Instead, he sought alignment through shared objectives. Grand strategy briefings became opportunities not merely to assign targets, but to articulate the broader arc of humanity's destiny. He spoke of the Imperium not as empire, but as inheritance reclaimed. He reminded his brothers that each victory secured a fragment of humanity's scattered past. Worlds lost during the Age of Strife were not mere territories. They were kin returned to the fold. The Great Crusade was restoration, not domination. Framed thus, ambition found constructive channel. For a time, the approach succeeded. Campaigns continued with remarkable efficiency. In one sector bordering a dense nebula region, an alliance of human and Xenos polities resisted Imperial overtures with unexpected coordination. Their fleets utilized gravitational anomalies to stage ambushes, forcing the Imperium to adapt tactics rapidly. Rather than respond with indiscriminate force, the warrior convened a coalition of legions, integrating diverse strengths into a unified assault. The resulting engagement demonstrated the Imperium's growing sophistication. Astartes strike cruisers feigned vulnerability, drawing hostile forces into pre-selected corridors of space. Mechanicum vessels deployed experimental weaponry to destabilize enemy formations. Imperial army regiments secured planetary objectives with disciplined precision. Within months, the alliance fractured. Human worlds were offered compliance under generous terms. Xeno's strongholds were dismantled. Victory was decisive, yet tempered. He ensured that the surviving populations witnessed not only the Imperium's power, but its capacity for order. Reconstruction teams followed swiftly. Administrators replaced warlords. Trade resumed under standardized tariffs. Stability became visible, tangible. Such successes reinforced the belief that the Crusade was self-sustaining. And yet, beyond visible achievements, unease persisted in quieter quarters. Navigators reported subtle shifts within the warp, currents that felt unfamiliar, patterns that defied established charts. Astropaths described fleeting impressions of distant agitation, like echoes of storms not yet arrived. These accounts were catalogued, analyzed, and largely attributed to natural fluctuation. The warp had always been volatile. Humanity had simply learned to navigate its temper. Still, seasoned officers exchanged cautious glances. The warrior received these reports with composed attention. He neither dismissed nor exaggerated them. Instead, he issued directives to enhance reconnaissance along less stable routes. Contingency plans were refined. Reserve fleets positioned strategically. Preparation, he believed, was the antidote to uncertainty. In private reflection, however, he acknowledged a deeper truth. The Imperium's strength lay in unity of purpose, yet its reliance upon the warp was inescapable. Every voyage, every message, every reinforcement depended upon a dimension inherently unpredictable. The Emperor had mastered much, but even he treated the immaterium with calculated respect. To expand ever outward was to accept increasing exposure to forces not entirely understood. Faith in reason remained the Imperium's guiding doctrine. The imperial truth rejected superstition, insisting that all phenomena could ultimately be comprehended through knowledge. The warrior upheld this principle publicly and personally. Yet knowledge required time, and expansion allowed little pause for study. Conquest demanded momentum. Thus the Crusade advanced, balanced between confidence and caution. On compliant worlds newly integrated into the Imperium, citizens gazed upward as fleets departed, their hulls gleaming against the void. They saw guardians moving onward to secure distant frontos. They felt pride in belonging to something immense and purposeful. Across sectors, banners bearing the Aquila fluttered above administrative spires. Humanity's resurgence seemed inexorable. Within his flagship, the warrior spent long hours observing starfields through reinforced viewports. There was solace in their constancy. Stars burned with indifferent persistence, their light traversing millennia to reach mortal eyes. Against such vastness, individual doubt diminished. He reminded himself that the Emperor's design encompassed scales beyond any single campaign. Silence from terror did not imply abandonment. It signified focus. He resolved to remain worthy of that trust. In council sessions, he listened more than he spoke. In battle, he acted with decisive clarity. In governance, he sought equilibrium between firmness and foresight. The burden of command had not lessened, it had deepened, yet he bore it without visible strain. Across the Imperium, the sense of destiny endured. The Great Crusade was no longer merely expansion. It was transformation of worlds, of institutions, of the very conception of humanity's place in the cosmos. The warrior at its helm perceived both the grandeur and the fragility of this moment. Unity was powerful, but it required vigilance. And so, amid the measured rhythm of void-ship engines and the distant murmur of estropathic choirs, the Imperium continued forward. Between the stars lay silence, vast, patient, and watchful. For now, that silence held, and within it, humanity's champions pressed onward, unaware how profoundly that quiet would one day be broken. By the middle decades of the Great Crusade, victory had become familiar. It arrived not as celebration, but as routine confirmation of the Imperium's momentum. Compliance declarations flowed steadily through astropathic channels. Sector after sector recorded stabilization. Expeditionary fleets, once isolated pioneers at the edge of uncertainty, now operated within an expanding web of allied systems. What had begun as reclamation was maturing into governance on a galactic scale. The warrior entrusted with supreme command understood that familiarity was both strength and danger. Triumph could inspire discipline, yet it could also cultivate assumption. If victory was expected, preparation might dull. If unity were presumed, vigilance might soften. He resolved that neither would be permitted. Each campaign, regardless of scale, was approached with the same meticulous scrutiny that had defined the Crusade's earliest years. In council assemblies convened aboard his flagship, he studied tactical projections with unwavering attention. He invited dissenting perspective from his captains, encouraging thorough analysis rather than passive agreement. The legions under his indirect authority spanned diverse temperaments and doctrines. Their cooperation required deliberate reinforcement. Where tension surfaced, he addressed it with calm authority, neither dismissing concerns nor indulging rivalry. He recognized that unity was not a static condition, but a continuous act. Meanwhile, the emperor remained upon Terra, immersed in undertakings unseen. Official communiques affirmed his guidance and satisfaction with the Crusade's progress. Yet personal audiences grew rare. The warrior interpreted this distance not as withdrawal of trust, but as confirmation of responsibility. The emperor had entrusted him with the Imperium's forward motion. That trust must not be misplaced. Across newly compliant worlds, the transformation of society accelerated. Administrative officials established census protocols and taxation structures. Mechanicum adepts restored dormant manufactoria, reawakening ancient production lines that had slumbered for centuries. Scholastica institutions introduced standardized curricula centered upon the imperial truth. Planetary defense forces were reorganized according to uniform doctrine, ensuring compatibility with broader military command. The scale of coordination was unprecedented in human history. Astropathic choirs labored without pause, transmitting decrees and receiving reports. Navigators plotted increasingly complex routes as trade networks multiplied. The Imperium was no longer a series of military victories connected by fragile lines. It was evolving into an interconnected civilization. Yet expansion revealed disparities. Some worlds embraced integration with visible relief, their populations eager for stability after long isolation. Others complied outwardly while retaining quiet skepticism. Cultural divergences, shaped by centuries of separation, did not dissolve overnight. The warrior instructed his governors to proceed with patience where possible, strength where necessary. Assimilation required more than banners and proclamations. It required time. Time, however, was a limited resource. Beyond secured sectors lay regions still uncharted. Reports from reconnaissance elements described alien empires consolidating along distant borders. Though none yet posed existential threat, their awareness of the Imperium's growth was undeniable. The galaxy was not empty. It was watchful. In response, the warrior intensified strategic mapping initiatives. Explorative fleets were dispatched not merely to conquer, but to observe. Knowledge, he believed, was the foundation of enduring security. To assume invulnerability would invite unforeseen peril. During one notable campaign at the fringe of a densely populated stellar cluster, this philosophy proved essential. Initial surveys suggested minimal resistance. Human settlements scattered across the cluster signaled tentative willingness to negotiate compliance. Yet deeper investigation revealed a hidden influence, an advanced Xenos polity exerting subtle control through trade dependency and technological leverage. Open assault would have provoked widespread devastation. Instead, the warrior orchestrated a measured intervention. Diplomatic envoys offered the human settlements alternatives, direct integration with the Imperium, access to broader trade networks, protection under Staat's oversight. Simultaneously, covert operations disrupted the Xeno supply chain, undermining their influence without immediate escalation. When confrontation became unavoidable, it occurred under conditions favorable to Imperial forces. The resulting void engagements were brief and decisive. The Xeno strongholds collapsed. The human worlds, spared catastrophic collateral damage, entered compliance with minimal resentment. Such operations reinforced the perception that the Imperium was guided not only by strength, but by foresight. Within his private chambers, however, the warrior contemplated the broader implications. Each success increased the Imperium's complexity. Administration required delegation. Delegation required trust. Trust, distributed across such vast distances, was inherently vulnerable to misinterpretation. He reflected upon his brothers. Each Primarch commanded loyalty of unparalleled intensity. Their legions revered them as exemplars of genetic and ideological perfection. While this devotion ensured battlefield cohesion, it also concentrated authority in singular figures. The Emperor's design had anticipated this. The Primarchs were intended as pillars of a unified structure. Yet pillars, if misaligned, could destabilize the whole. There was no evidence of fracture, no overt disloyalty. Still, he remained attentive to subtle divergences in tone and ambition during high-level councils. He sought to frame discussions around shared objectives rather than individual achievement. In his presence, rivalry softened into professional exchange. Confidence in the Crusade's inevitability persisted. Remembrances recorded epics of compliance. Artists depicted fleets arrayed against nebula backdrops, their hulls illuminated by distant suns. Civilians on compliant worlds spoke of belonging to something vast and purposeful. For many, the Imperium represented not conquest, but deliverance from uncertainty. Yet the warrior knew that destiny required maintenance. He walked the observation decks of his flagship in quiet hours, the glow of distant stars reflecting upon polished armor. Beyond reinforced glass, the void stretched immeasurable and indifferent. Humanity's resurgence, for all its scale, occupied only a fraction of that immensity. Perspective tempered pride. He considered the Emperor's vision, a unified humanity governed by reason, free from superstition and internal strife. The Crusade had brought that vision within reach. But realization demanded more than expansion. It required resilience against unseen challenges. Astropathic murmurs occasionally hinted at anomalies within the warp, brief disturbances, localized and fleeting. None disrupted operations significantly, yet their occurrence suggested patterns not yet understood. The warrior authorized increased study, directing select fleets to monitor affected regions. Preparedness remained paramount. Still, outwardly, the Imperium stood unshaken. Fleet formations advanced with disciplined precision. Compliance ceremonies unfolded beneath banners of the Aquila. Governors pledged loyalty in the Emperor's name. The machinery of empire operated with growing efficiency. In council briefings, he spoke with calm authority. He reminded the commanders that triumph was not culmination. It was foundation. The Great Crusade was not measured solely in territory gained, but in unity secured. To preserve that unity required unwavering commitment, to reason, to discipline, to each other. His words carried weight because they were matched by action. And so the Imperium continued its measured advance. The stars did not yield easily, but they yielded nonetheless. Each campaign concluded strengthened the belief that humanity's dominion was both rightful and enduring. Yet beneath the steady rhythm of conquest and consolidation, subtle currents gathered, unseen, patient, awaiting convergence. For now, triumph prevailed. The warrior bore its weight with composed resolve, aware that even the most luminous victories cast long and quiet shadows across the endless night. By the time the Great Crusade entered its later decades, the Imperium had grown so vast that no single mind could fully comprehend its extent. Star maps once considered ambitious now appeared conservative beside updated charts. Whole sectors, formerly unknown, had been integrated into the expanding lattice of imperial governance. Astropathic relays flickered like constellations within the darkness, stitching together distant regions with threads of psychic communication. The Imperium no longer seemed a rising power. It felt established, assured of its place among the stars. Yet establishment brought a different kind of challenge. The warrior who carried the Emperor's trust sensed it in the quiet pauses between briefings, in the measured tones of admirals who spoke of logistics more often than glory. Expansion had been a clear objective. Consolidation required subtler judgment. To maintain cohesion across such breadth demanded foresight equal to any battlefield maneuver. He convened strategic symposia more frequently, gathering representatives from multiple legions, the Imperial Army, the Mechanicum, and the Administratum. These assemblies were not spectacles of authority, but exercises in alignment. Supply chains were reviewed with meticulous care. Reinforcement corridors were analyzed for vulnerability. Reserve forces are positioned not merely at borders, but within the Imperium's interior, ensuring stability against unforeseen disruption. He spoke often of endurance. A campaign won through force could be lost through neglect. Worlds newly compliant required infrastructure, education, and integration into trade networks. He directed that compliance not be treated as conclusion, but as commencement. The Imperium must be present not only in war, but in daily life. Reports from Terra remained formal, precise, and increasingly abstract. The Emperor's endeavors, though undisclosed in detail, were described as essential to humanity's ultimate security. The warrior accepted this without hesitation. If the Crusade represented outward expansion, then Terra's hidden works likely secured the foundation beneath it. Still, the absence of personal counsel lingered. He remembered earlier years when the Emperor had stood beside his sons upon the fields of Conquest, offering not merely command but presence. That era had passed. Now, trust was conveyed through delegation. Authority rested upon his shoulders more visibly than ever before. He bore it without complaint. On the frontier, exploration fleets began encountering regions of unusual density, clusters where stellar phenomena interfered with standard navigation. Warp translation in these zones required exceptional skill, and even then, anomalies were reported. Some ships emerged from transit displaced by weeks beyond projected arrival. Others described unsettling impressions during passage, as occurrence within the Imperium had shifted subtly against established expectation. Navigators voiced caution, but none advocated retreat. The Crusade had been built upon calculated risk. To halt progress because of fluctuation would undermine the Imperium's momentum. Instead, the warrior authorized expanded study. Specialist attachment accompanied subsequent expeditions, tasked with recording warp behavior in unprecedented detail. Knowledge would counter uncertainty. In one such region, an isolated human civilization was discovered orbiting a dim red star. Their technology had regressed during centuries of separation, yet their society exhibited remarkable cohesion. When presented with the opportunity to rejoin humanity's broader fold, they hesitated, citing ancestral warnings of distant authority. The warrior chose dialogue before force. He dispatched envoys who spoke not of dominance, but of reunion. They shared accounts of Terra's restoration, of worlds reclaimed from ruin, a prosperity born from unity. Gradually, resistance softened. The civilization accepted compliance not under duress, but through persuasion. This victory, quiet and bloodless, resonated deeply. It affirmed that the Imperium's strength did not lie solely in its legions, but in the narrative of shared destiny. Humanity, long fragmented, could be drawn together through vision as well as power. The warrior regarded such outcomes as validation of the Emperor's grand design. Yet beyond the boundaries of diplomatic success, shadows lengthened. Intelligence gathered from exploratory patrols suggested that certain Xenos entities had begun withdrawing from regions approached by Imperial fleets. This retreat was not chaotic, but organized. Entire systems were abandoned before direct contact occurred. Whether this signified fear, strategy, or preparation remained unclear. He instructed vigilance. The Imperium would not assume that silence equals submission. Reconnaissance was intensified. Data from disparate sectors were cross-referenced for pattern. Though no immediate threat materialized, the pattern of calculated absence unsettled experienced commanders. Within the councils of the Primarchs, subtle differences of opinion resurfaced. Some advocated accelerating expansion to overwhelm potential adversaries preemptively. Others argued for fortification and internal strengthening before pressing further outward. The warrior listened, weighing each perspective carefully. He recognized merit in both urgency and caution. Ultimately, he advocated balance. Expansion would continue, but not recklessly. Consolidation would proceed, but not stagnate. The Imperium must remain dynamic, adapting without losing cohesion. His measured stance maintained consensus, though not without private reservations among certain brothers. Still, unity endured. Across compliant worlds, the Aquila remained unchallenged. Trade flowed steadily between sectors once isolated by centuries of mistrust. The imperial truth continued to replace superstition with structured understanding. Humanity's resurgence appeared not only sustainable, but inevitable. Yet inevitability was a perception, not a guarantee. In solitary moments, standing before vast viewports as starfields drifted slowly past, the warrior contemplated the horizon. The galaxy's immensity was humbling. Each advance revealed further unknowns. Every solved challenge uncovered new complexities. He did not fear these realities. He respected them. The Emperor's vision demanded more than conquest. It demanded resilience against variables unseen. The warrior resolved to strengthen the Imperium's foundations as diligently as he extended its borders. He reviewed contingency protocols personally, ensuring that lines of succession and command remained clear should communication falter. He considered not only the present, but the potential absence of guidance. Such thoughts were not born of doubt, but of prudence. An empire of this scale could not depend solely upon proximity to its sovereign. It must be capable of enduring through delegated authority. And so, the Great Crusade advanced toward new frontiers. Fleet engines ignited against the velvet dark. Astropathic choirs prepared fresh transmissions. Legionaries stood ready within drop bays, their armor reflecting distant starlight. The Imperium moved as a singular organism, vast and coordinated. At its heart stood the warrior who carried the Emperor's confidence, a figure of composure amid expansion's relentless pace. Ahead lay regions yet unmapped, currents yet studied, intentions yet revealed. The horizon did not recede, it transformed. And as the fleets translated once more into the shifting tides of the warp, humanity pressed onward, luminous, determined, and unaware of how close the edge of that horizon had drawn. In the later passages of the Great Crusade's long advance, a subtle transformation began to take shape, not in open rebellion, nor in visible fracture, but in tone. The Imperium still expanded. Fleets still translated into the warp with disciplined precision. Compliant ceremonies still unfolded beneath towering standards bearing the Aquila. From a distance, the pattern of conquest appeared unbroken. Yet those entrusted with its highest command sensed that momentum alone no longer defined the era. Something quieter had entered the rhythm of expansion. The warrior at the center of imperial authority perceived it first as atmosphere. Reports continued to arrive with predictable cadence. Worlds pacified, alliances formalized, resources catalogued. Yet the language of these transmissions had changed. Where earlier communiques carried restrained optimism, newer ones emphasized caution. Sector governors requested clarification of policy more frequently. Navigators appended extended advisories to routine transit reports. Astropaths described their work as increasingly taxing, as though the Imperium pressed back with intangible resistance. None of this constituted crisis. Yet together, these elements formed an undercurrent. The Emperor remained upon terror, engaged in endeavors of profound secrecy. Official decrees confirmed his unwavering oversight. Still, the distance between sovereign and crusade had grown into a constant presence. The warrior did not question the necessity of that separation. He accepted it as testament to trust. Yet he understood that trust required reinforcement through visible cohesion among those who acted in the Emperor's name. He intensified coordination among the legions. Joint operations became more frequent, not merely for strategic advantage, but to sustain fraternity. Campaigns were structured to encourage collaboration between Primarchs whose temperaments diverged sharply. Where philosophical disagreements surfaced in council, he reframed them within the broader arc of unity. He neither suppressed individuality nor allowed it to dominate collective purpose. The Imperium's strength, he believed, lay in convergence. During this period, several frontier expeditions encountered phenomena that resisted simple explanation. Warp translation into specific systems resulted in temporal discrepancies beyond established margins. Ships emerged reporting sensory distortions, echoes of sound without source, fleeting impressions of forms within the tides of unreality. Navigators insisted that such anomalies were not unprecedented, yet their frequency prompted concern. Mechanicum scholars were dispatched to investigate patterns. Their analyses remained inconclusive. Statistical irregularities were acknowledged but attributed to natural variance within an inherently unstable dimension. The warrior accepted these conclusions publicly. Privately, he authorized expanded monitoring of affected corridors. Preparation was not alarm. It was discipline. Meanwhile, within compliant territories, signs of cultural strain appeared in isolated instances. On certain worlds, adherence to the imperial truth met with quiet resistance among populations whose traditions were deeply rooted. Most such resistance manifested as passive reluctance, resolved through patient governance. A few incidents escalated into localized unrest, swiftly contained by imperial forces. The warrior viewed these disturbances not as ideological threat, but as reminders of the Imperium's vast diversity. Unity required adaptation. Doctrine must be applied with firmness, yet not blindness. He directed that remembrances and iterators accompany compliance forces more frequently, ensuring that the narrative of shared destiny was articulated clearly and consistently. Even so, he could not ignore the widening scope of his responsibilities. Where once he had commanded fleets in person, now he orchestrated campaigns across multiple sectors simultaneously. Strategic decisions carried consequences far beyond immediate engagements. A miscalculation in supply allocation could ripple across light years. A misjudged appointment of planetary governance might destabilize entire trade networks. The burden of foresight weighed heavily. In moments of rare solitude, he considered the Emperor's vision in its purest form, a humanity united not merely through conquest, but through enlightened purpose. The Great Crusade had nearly achieved territorial unity. Yet unity of spirit remained more delicate. He wondered whether expansion itself imposed strain. Each new world integrated into the Imperium added strength, yet also complexity. Each newly rediscovered Primarch brought renewed vigor, yet also unique perspective. Brotherhood endured, but scale magnified difference. During a grand convocation of Primarchs held within the vast strategium of his flagship, discussion turned to the pace of advancement. Some advocated pressing outward with unrelenting acceleration, arguing that hesitation would embolden external powers. Others counseled consolidation, warning that overextension could create vulnerabilities within. The warrior listened in composed silence before offering measured synthesis. The Imperium would continue forward, but not at the expense of internal coherence. Expansion and consolidation would proceed in deliberate alternation. Fleets would not abandon secured sectors prematurely. Resources would be balanced between frontier and foundation. His proposal prevailed. Consensus restored. The Primarchs dispersed to their respective theaters. Yet beneath agreement lingered an intangible tension, not disagreement in loyalty, but divergence in emphasis. Beyond imperial borders, patterns of withdrawal among certain Xenos polities intensified. Entire trade routes once occupied by alien merchant fleets fell silent before imperial arrival. Reconnaissance detected abandoned orbital structures, stripped of valuable materials yet devoid of signs of recent battle. It was as though unseen observers calculated distance carefully, avoiding direct confrontation while studying the Imperium's advance. Such behavior defied simplistic categorization. The warrior instructed that caution temper pursuit. An enemy unseen could not be engaged blindly. Observation would precede escalation. Within the warp itself, Astropath began reporting dreams, indistinct impressions of turbulence gathering beyond perceptible horizons. Choir masters described increased difficulty maintaining harmonic clarity during long-range transmissions. These reports were recorded without public alarm. Still, their recurrence unsettled even seasoned adepts. The Imperium, outwardly serene, was encountering resistance not in open war, but in environment. Yet no catastrophe erupted. Campaigns continued. Compliance ceremonies proceeded. Manufactoria produced at record capacity. Trade flourished across sectors once isolated. Humanity's resurgence remained visible and formidable. The warrior maintained unwavering composure. He addressed his commanders with steady voice, reaffirming shared purpose. He reviewed contingency plans with meticulous care. He strengthened bonds among his brothers through coordinated endeavor. If an undercurrent gathered beneath the surface of triumph, he would meet it with preparation rather than fear. In the quiet of his observation chamber, gazing into the depthless scatter of stars, he acknowledged a truth both humbling and resolute. The Great Crusade had been an age of ascent. Now it was becoming an age of endurance. The Emperor's vision remained luminous, yet its preservation would demand vigilance equal to its creation. The warrior accepted this without hesitation. He did not yet perceive the shape of future trials, but he sensed their inevitability as surely as gravity binds celestial bodies. And so the Imperium moved forward still, brilliant, disciplined, and immense. Beneath its steady advance, currents gathered in silence. For now, they remained unseen, felt only as faint pressure at the edge of awareness, like distant thunder beyond the rim of stars. In the long span of the Great Crusade, there came a period when progress continued outwardly unchanged, yet inwardly something subtle began to shift. The Imperium still advanced. Expeditionary fleets translated into the warp with disciplined regularity. Legionaries descended upon resistant worlds with practiced precision. Compliance ceremonies unfolded beneath towering banners, their symbolism unquestioned. To most observers, to governors, to remembrancers, to the countless citizens newly folded into imperial unity, the age remained one of unbroken ascent. But for those positioned near the heart of command, certainty no longer felt absolute. The warrior who bore the Emperor's confidence sensed it in the cadence of briefings and in the silence that followed them. Reports arrived on schedule, victories confirmed, losses recorded within acceptable parameters. Yet beneath the data lay an intangible tension, a growing awareness that scale itself had become a variable. The Imperium was no longer merely expanding. It was stretching. Supply corridors lengthened across sectors where warp currents behaved unpredictably. Reinforcements dispatched to distant fronts required extended transit, their arrival dependent upon navigational precision that could never be entirely guaranteed. Astropathic transmissions, once crisp and resonant, increasingly demanded repetition to ensure clarity. None of this constituted failure, yet it required vigilance beyond routine. The Emperor remained upon terra, immersed in works whose magnitude could only be inferred. His directives continued to affirm confidence in the Crusade's leadership. Still, personal audiences were rare, and the warrior found himself reflecting more frequently upon earlier years, when father and sons had stood together upon conquered soil, when instruction had flowed not only through decree but through presence. Now, presence was replaced by responsibility. He convened a council of Primarchs within a vast orbital bastion recently secured at the frontier. The chamber's architecture was severe and monumental, its windows revealing a star system newly compliant and quiet. There, beneath vaulted ceilings and the measured hum of void shields, discussion turned toward sustainability. One brother spoke of momentum, of striking swiftly before alien powers consolidated. Another cautioned against overextension, noting the strain upon auxiliary forces tasked with governance. Others raised concerns regarding the growing autonomy of certain sector commanders, whose decisions, though loyal in intent, varied in interpretation of imperial doctrine. The warrior listened without interruption. When he spoke, his voice carried neither rebuke nor urgency, but deliberate clarity. Expansion, he reminded them, had been the Emperor's design, yet unity remained its foundation. Autonomy was necessary across such vastness, but alignment must be preserved. To that end, he proposed standardized review intervals for sector governance, enhanced communication protocols, and rotational collaboration among legions to prevent insularity. Agreement followed, though not without lingering divergence in tone. Brotherhood endured, but perspective had widened. Each Primarch commanded territories whose cultures, resources, and challenges differed profoundly. Experience shaped outlook. While loyalty to the Emperor remained inviolate, interpretations of how best to serve his vision began to acquire sharper edges. The warrior recognized that such variation was inevitable. It was not dissent, it was complexity. Beyond council chambers, events on the frontier reinforced his concerns. In a region dense with variable stars, an expeditionary fleet encountered a human polity whose technological development rivaled early imperial standards. Unlike most rediscovered civilizations, this society had not regressed. It had advanced independently, cultivating its own interstellar network. Their leaders did not reject reunion outright. They questioned it. They asked what sovereignty would remain. They inquired how their scientific institutions would integrate with the Mechanicum. They expressed unease at the scale of imperial authority. Negotiations extended longer than anticipated. The warrior permitted patience. Force could have secured compliance swiftly, but he judged that unnecessary violence against capable humankin would erode the moral architecture of unity. Envoys exchanged knowledge. Cultural delegations traveled between vessels. Gradually, alignment emerged. Yet the encounter left impression. Humanity, scattered for millennia, had not evolved uniformly. Some fragments had grown accustomed to independence. To integrate them required diplomacy as refined as any weapon. Simultaneously, warp irregularities intensified along certain routes. Navigators reported corridors that seemed to narrow unpredictably, currents shifting without precedent. Astropaths described fleeting impressions of distant agitation, not localized storms, but a broader unease within the Imperium itself. The Mechanicum's assessments remained cautious. No definitive pattern was established. Still, the warrior authorized additional relay stations in relatively stable systems, reducing reliance upon singular routes. Redundancy became doctrine. In quiet hours, alone within his strategium, he contemplated the nature of certainty. The early crusade had been defined by clarity. Humanity divided, then reunited through disciplined expansion. The path had seemed linear, its objective unmistakable. Now, though progress continued, the path branched. Decisions carried cascading consequences across light years. He did not doubt the Emperor, but he began to appreciate the magnitude of stewardship entrusted to him. Among the legions, morale remained high. Victories still outnumbered setbacks. Remembrances composed epics celebrating unity's triumph over fragmentation. Civilians on compliant worlds experienced tangible improvements in stability and prosperity. From most vantage points, the Imperium's cause appeared unassailable. Yet leadership required awareness beyond appearances. The warrior initiated a comprehensive review of command hierarchies. Succession protocols were clarified. Lines of authority were codified with renewed precision. He emphasized transparency in reporting, ensuring that deviations from doctrine were addressed constructively rather than concealed. He also sought more frequent correspondence with his brothers, not solely for strategy, but for understanding. Bonds forged in shared origin required maintenance across distance. Where rivalry once fueled excellence, he encouraged mutual reinforcement. Still, beneath the surface of unity, faint lines of strain could be discerned. They were not fractures. Not yet. They were adjustments to weight. The Imperium had grown immense, luminous, and confident. Yet immensity carried gravity. The warrior sense of the era of effortless ascent had ended. What lay ahead would demand resilience equal to ambition. Beyond the reinforced glass of his flagship's observation deck, the stars shimmered with indifferent brilliance. Each point of light represented a potential future, compliant, contested, or unknown. The galaxy did not yield entirely. It responded. He accepted that response with calm resolve. The Great Crusade would continue. Unity would endure. But certainty, once instinctive, now required deliberate cultivation. And in that recognition, quiet, measured, and unspoken, the first subtle fractures of absolute confidence began to form, not as weakness, but as awareness of the vast and watchful darkness that surrounded humanity's rising light. As the Great Crusade pressed onward into its widening arc, the Imperium began to experience a phenomenon less visible than war, yet equally transformative: distance. Not merely distance measured in light years, nor in the weeks required for warp translation, but distance of perspective. The Emperor remained upon Terra, the radiant axis around which all loyalty revolved. His decrees continued to arrive with unwavering authority. His grand design, a united humanity governed by reason and freed from the superstitions of old night, remained unchanged. Yet the practical interpretation of that design increasingly rested in the hands of his sons. The warrior entrusted with overarching command felt that shift with growing clarity. It was not rebellion. It was not even disagreement in the conventional sense. It was a subtle divergence that arises when powerful minds confront unprecedented scale. Each Primarch, shaped by unique upbringing and hardened by individual conquest, now administered territories vast enough to rival ancient empires of old Earth. Their experiences differed. Their challenges varied. Inevitably, their emphasis evolved. In council, discussions grew more nuanced. Where once the question had been how swiftly to conquer, it now became how best to preserve. Some advocated rigorous standardization of all compliant worlds, arguing that uniformity ensured resilience. Others favored adaptive governance, permitting cultural variance provided loyalty remained absolute. These debates were conducted without hostility, yet beneath them lay the recognition that the Imperium was no longer a singular campaign. It was a civilization in formation. The warrior listened with measured patience. He sought equilibrium, reminding his brothers that unity did not require sameness, but alignment of purpose. The Emperor's vision was expansive. It could encompass variation so long as allegiance endured. Still, he sensed that interpretation, once instinctively shared, now required articulation. Beyond the councils of command, subtle signs of strain multiplied. Warp routes previously stable began to fluctuate with irregular intensity. Navigators reported passages that felt constricted, as though unseen currents pressed inward. Astropathic choirs labored under increasing psychic fatigue, their transmissions occasionally arriving fragmented despite disciplined repetition. These disruptions did not halt the crusade, yet they imposed caution upon its rhythm. The Mechanicum intensified study of these anomalies, dispatching survey vessels equipped with augmented sensorium arrays. Their findings remained inconclusive. Statistical deviation from baseline warp behavior was acknowledged, but no definitive cause identified. The warrior received these reports with composed attention. Contingency planning expanded quietly across multiple sectors. Meanwhile, on the frontier, the Imperium encountered resistance of a different kind. A coalition of human systems, technologically advanced and culturally cohesive, rejected immediate compliance not out of hostility, but from philosophical divergence. They professed admiration for Terra's achievements, yet hesitated at the scale of centralized authority. They feared that integration would diminish their autonomy. The warrior chose engagement over eradication. He traveled personally to their principal world, not as conqueror, but as representative of shared origin. Before their governing assembly, he spoke of humanity's long isolation, of how fragmentation had nearly extinguished the species. He described the warp storms that had severed colony from one another, the regressions and devastations that followed. Unity, he explained, was not domination, it was survival. The deliberations lasted many days. Ultimately, compliance was achieved without battle. The coalition entered the Imperium with negotiated terms that preserved certain local institutions while affirming absolute loyalty to Terra. It was a delicate balance, yet one that reflected the Imperium's maturation. Such outcomes reassured many within the Crusade's leadership. They demonstrated that strength could coexist with diplomacy. They reinforced the narrative that humanity's destiny was collective. Yet even as successes accumulated, the warrior felt the weight of stewardship deepen. In private reflection, he considered the Emperor's absence from the field. The physical distance between Terra and the frontier had grown immense. Communication endured, yet the immediacy of shared presence had diminished. The Primarchs were no longer merely generals executing a father's will. They were architects shaping the Imperium's lived reality. Responsibility had diffused. He responded by strengthening lines of accountability. Sector commanders were required to submit comprehensive strategic audits. Rotational oversight ensured that no single legion operated too long without external collaboration. Interlegion exercises fostered familiarity and mitigated insularity. Yet beneath these structural measures, an intangible atmosphere persisted. Reports from isolated astropathic choirs spoke of indistinct dreams, not prophetic nor coherent, but unsettling in tone. Navigators described moments during transit when the warp's turbulence felt purposeful rather than random. These impressions were recorded without public alarm. The imperial truth discouraged superstition, and no empirical evidence supported extraordinary conclusions. Still, experienced minds recognized pattern when it gathered. The warrior refused speculation. He relied upon preparation. He commissioned enhanced fortification of key relay systems, ensuring redundancy in communication. Reserve fleets were positioned within stable sectors to respond rapidly should routes collapse. Administrative contingencies were drafted in the event of prolonged isolation between regions. To many observers, such measures appeared prudent but excessive. To him, they were necessary. The Imperium's greatest strength, Its vastness could also become vulnerability if cohesion faltered. He would not permit complacency to erode what had been so painstakingly constructed. Among the legions, morale remained outwardly steadfast. Victories continued. Worlds complied. The Aquila spread across the firmament. Yet within private correspondence exchange between Primarchs, subtle variations in tone emerged, reflections on governance, on autonomy, on the interpretation of Imperial doctrine. The warrior answered each with calm clarity. He emphasized shared origin, shared purpose, shared destiny. He avoided confrontation, preferring persuasion. He believed sincerely that unity, once consciously reaffirmed, would endure. And yet, as he stood upon the observation deck of his flagship, gazing into the depthless scatter of distant stars, he acknowledged a quiet truth. The Great Crusade had carried humanity from fragmentation to dominion, but dominion was not the same as permanence. Permanence required cohesion under strain. The stars remained silent. Warp currents shimmered unpredictably beyond armored hulls. Astropathic whispers traversed unimaginable distances. The Imperium advanced still, luminous and resolute. But distance, of space, of perspective, of interpretation, had begun to cast its long and patient shadow. And within that shadow, unseen yet gathering, the future waited. In the unfolding chronicle of the Great Crusade, there are passages that appear serene when viewed from afar, stretches of expansion unmarred by catastrophe, seasons of governance unmarred by revolt. Yet serenity can conceal complexity, and complexity, if unexamined, may become dissonance. By this stage of the Imperium's ascent, the map of reclaimed space had grown so extensive that new conquests no longer felt like revelations. They were continuations. The crusade had become an enduring condition rather than an extraordinary undertaking. Fleets launched as a matter of course. Compliance was expected. The machinery of empire operated with increasing sophistication. And yet, beneath this appearance of equilibrium, a subtle rebalancing was underway. The warrior who bore the emperor's authority had long accepted that distance from terror was both necessity and trial. Now, that distance had matured into a defining feature of command. Entire campaigns unfolded without direct consultation. Decisions of lasting consequence were rendered at the frontier, shaped by interpretation rather than instruction. He did not resent this burden. He embraced it. Still, he recognized that interpretation required vigilance. The emperor's vision was vast, yet not infinite in flexibility. It demanded unity of outcome even when methods varied. Ensuring that alignment across light years required more than loyalty, it required shared conviction. In recent councils, he had observed a gradual sharpening of tone among some of his brothers. Not defiance, not dissent, but a heightened insistence upon particular approaches. One emphasized absolute doctrinal uniformity, arguing that deviation invited instability. Another advocated adaptive governance, trusting local strength so long as fealty remained unquestioned. A third spoke increasingly of honor and distinction, of the importance of recognition for sacrifice. Each perspective possessed merit. Each carried potential risk. The warrior responded not with censure, but with deliberate reinforcement of collective purpose. He initiated expanded interlegion deployments, ensuring that no Primarch operated in prolonged isolation from the others. Shared victories fostered mutual respect. Collaborative campaigns diluted the formation of ideological enclaves. For a time, this strategy succeeded. Yet external pressures mounted in parallel. Warp disturbances, once irregular curiosities, now exhibited pattern. Certain corridors grew persistently unstable, forcing rerouting of supply convoys. Astropathic transmissions from specific regions arrived muted, as though filtered through unseen interference. None of these phenomena halted the crusade, but they introduced delay, and delay, within a structure so vast, amplified consequences. The Mechanicum's analyses remained cautious. No definitive anomaly could be isolated. Statistical variance fell within expanded tolerances. The Imperial truth allowed no space for superstition. All phenomena would yield to understanding in due time. The warrior accepted this framework, but he did not ignore the accumulation of strain. In response, he authorized the establishment of secondary command hubs within strategically stable sectors. These bastions would serve as anchors should primary routes falter. He reinforced astropathic choirs with additional personnel, rotating them more frequently to prevent psychic exhaustion. He ordered logistical reserves increase along vulnerable frontiers. These measures were not publicly dramatized. They were implemented quietly, methodically. Meanwhile, the Imperium encountered frontier civilization whose resistance differed from prior engagements. Their society, human in origin yet shaped by centuries of philosophical divergence, possessed formidable voidcraft and disciplined defense fleets. Their leaders argued that humanity's survival did not require singular governance. They proposed alliance rather than absorption. Negotiations unfolded across multiple cycles. The warrior listened personally to their envoys, acknowledging the coherence of their argument while articulating the Imperium's necessity. Fragmented strength, he explained, had once nearly doomed the species. Unity under terror was not a preference. It was a safeguard against existential threat. The impasse persisted. Ultimately, measured force was employed, precise strikes against military assets, targeted disabling of orbital platforms. The campaign was swift and restrained, minimizing devastation while demonstrating incontrovertible superiority. Compliance followed, though not with the quiet acceptance seen elsewhere. In the aftermath, reconstruction began immediately, yet the encounter left a mark upon the warriors' thoughts. Increasingly, resistance was philosophical rather than primitive. Humanity's rediscovered fragments were not uniformly grateful. Some questioned the premise of centralized destiny. Such questions did not weaken his conviction. They clarified its stakes. Within his private strategium, surrounded by shifting holographic projections of Imperial space, he contemplated the fragility inherent in scale. The Imperium's unity rested upon shared belief in the Emperor's vision. If interpretation fractured, even subtly, cohesion could erode from within before any external adversary struck. He redoubled efforts to articulate that vision consistently. Messages transmitted to sector governors emphasized common heritage and collective survival. Remembrances were encouraged to highlight narratives of cooperation among legions rather than singular glory. The story of the Crusade was shaped deliberately, not as a tale of conquest alone, but as a restoration of a scattered family. Still, quiet unease lingered at the edges of awareness. Astropathic choirs reported an increasing frequency of indistinct impressions during long-range transmissions, sensations of distant agitation within the Imperium, neither localized nor comprehensible. Navigators described passages where the warp seemed to thicken unpredictably, resisting smooth translation. Such accounts were logged, studied, and ultimately classified as anomalies without confirmed cause. The Crusade pressed onward. Victories accumulated. Worlds stabilized. Trade networks flourished. Outwardly, the Imperium's ascent appeared unstoppable. Yet in the measured silence between campaigns, the warrior sensed the approach of something undefined. Not an event, not yet, but a threshold. Certainty, once instinctive, now required reinforcement through conscious reaffirmation. Brotherhood, once effortless, now demanded intentional maintenance. Distance, once logistical, had become conceptual. He did not waver. If dissonance threatened, he would counter it with clarity. If strain gathered, he would absorb it. He had been entrusted with more than fleets and sectors. He had been entrusted with continuity. Standing before the vast viewport of his flagship, watching as distant suns shimmered like embers scattered across velvet dark, he allowed himself a single, measured reflection. The Imperium had reached a moment before divergence, a poised stillness where momentum remained intact, yet pressure accumulated beneath the surface. The stars offered no warning. They burned with ancient indifference, and within that quiet, luminous expanse, humanity advanced, brilliant, unified, and standing unknowingly upon the threshold of its own dissonance. As the Great Crusade pressed into regions increasingly distant from terror, the Imperium's reach approached scales never before imagined. Fleets, once dispatched in isolated waves, now operated in overlapping networks, their coordination relying upon not only instruments of steel and ceramite but upon the delicate psychic lattice that threaded the warp itself. Each system integrated into the Imperium added to its apparent strength, yet also multiplied the dimensions of complexity. Expansion was no longer a matter solely of conquest. It was now a matter of orchestration across forces whose scale exceeded comprehension. The warrior entrusted with command perceived this truth with unerring clarity. He had long recognized that the Emperor's vision depended upon cohesion as much as capability. Every victory achieved across a remote system carried with it obligations far beyond the battlefield: governance, integration, vigilance. The success of the crusade now required constant maintenance of invisible structures as intricate as any manufacturum or void ship. In council, the Primarchs continued to exhibit both unity and variation. Some, their temperaments drawn toward decisive action, advocated rapid assimilation of new territories, arguing that delay risked confusion, rebellion, or external interference. Others, more contemplative in nature, emphasized patience, stressing that the human spirit, even after centuries of isolation, must be guided gently toward order. These discussions were devoid of argument in the sense of hostility. They were instead exercises in balance, a continuous negotiation between authority and autonomy, speed and stability. The warrior neither suppressed nor elevated particular voices. He mediated, he synthesized, he ensured that decisions reflected both the Emperor's intent and the operational reality of thousands of worlds under simultaneous stewardship. And though outward appearances suggested flawless harmony, he knew that the effort required was exhausting even to those accustomed to command. Every judgment carried consequences magnified across light years, and every lapse in foresight could ripple into disruption of a scale no single Primarch could entirely anticipate. Even as human realms were brought into compliance, new challenges arose along the frontier. Certain star systems, previously uncharted, revealed civilizations whose sophistication rivaled or exceeded early Imperial expectations. These societies were not universally hostile. Indeed, some greeted the crusade with cautious curiosity. Yet their independence and developed technologies posed questions for command. Could such systems be persuaded to integrate without eroding their cultural integrity? Could their loyalty be secured in a manner consistent with Imperial doctrine? The warrior approached each situation with measured consideration. He dispatched envoys and advisors who combined diplomacy, knowledge of history, and demonstration of strength. He employed targeted military maneuvers only when necessary, always accompanied by immediate reconstruction and support efforts. Compliance, he understood, was not merely the cessation of resistance but the perception of shared destiny. Human worlds did not survive through domination alone. They endured when guided toward order that felt both protective and purposeful. Simultaneously, warp currents, the medium through which interstellar communication and travel flowed, exhibited anomalies of increasing subtlety and persistence. Navigation reports described corridors where expected patterns deviated. Astropathic choirs reported impressions of agitation, diffuse and indistinct, as though the warp itself whispered caution. These disturbances were insufficient to halt operations, yet they introduced layers of uncertainty into routes previously considered stable. The Mechanicum catalogued the fluctuations rigorously, devising precautionary measures, but definitive explanation remained elusive. The warrior did not allow these uncertainties to govern his decisions. He regarded them as variables to be measured and mitigated, rather than portents to be feared. He reinforced relay systems, established redundant supply and communication networks, and rotated veteran commanders through vulnerable sectors. Vigilance, he believed, would counter imbalance. Preparedness, not fear, would preserve the Crusade's momentum. Yet even in this rigor, he was aware of a principle both subtle and profound. Scale alone cannot secure unity. The Imperium's vastness, while impressive, was inherently fragile. Loyalty could be tested by absence, miscommunication, or competing interpretation. Autonomy was necessary for operational efficiency, yet it risked divergence if not aligned through continuous reaffirmation. He addressed this by insisting on personal correspondence with each Primarch, not for the purpose of control, but for understanding, ensuring that strategy remained coherent and that alignment of intent endured. Beyond human governance, external pressures continued to accumulate. Certain xeno-civilizations withdrew quietly before Imperial presence, abandoning trade routes and installations with precise calculation, as though observing the Imperium's growth without engaging directly. Their motives remained inscrutable. The warrior responded with enhanced reconnaissance, careful observation, and strategic positioning, always maintaining the principle that insight precedes engagement. Knowledge, he knew, was as vital as strength. Amid these pressures, successes continued to fortify perception. Human worlds integrated, trade networks expanded, and industrial output increased. Compliance sectors exhibited stability, demonstrating the efficacy of coordinated governance and disciplined reinforcement. Yet even in triumph, the warrior maintained his reflection on fragility. Momentum was not permanence, and scale was not immunity. In moments of solitude aboard his flagship, he contemplated the immensity before him. Stars burned indifferent, constellations unaltered by the affairs of mortals. Each system reclaimed by the Crusade represented not only expansion but responsibility, a web of obligation extending farther than any mind could fully grasp. The weight of stewardship pressed lightly, yet persistently, a reminder that even the most luminous victories cast shadows across realms unseen. He considered the Emperor's vision in its entirety, a humanity united, rational, and safeguarded against its own tendencies toward fragmentation. This vision was radiant, yet delicate. Its preservation required diligence beyond that demanded by battle. It demanded attention to distance, to loyalty, to the imperceptible threads connecting thought, intention, and action across a galaxy vast and indifferent. The Crusade advanced still. Fleet engines ignited against the void with unerring discipline. Astropathic transmissions traveled along reinforced lines, bridging unimaginable distances. Legions executed their orders with precision. Human worlds, each in its own manner, continued to assimilate. Civilization spread, luminous and purposeful. And yet, beneath the surface of expansion, currents moved unseen. Gradations of tension, imperceptible to all but the most vigilant, began to gather the edges of perception. They were not yet disruption, not yet catastrophe, but they existed, quiet, patient, inevitable. The warrior observed, measured, and prepared. The Imperium pressed forward, brilliant and immense, unaware that the first threads of change are beginning to weave themselves into the fabric of its future. And in that quiet, limitless expanse, the veil of unseen currents began to gather, waiting to test the unity that the Great Crusade had so carefully built. The Great Crusade had persisted for decades, a relentless motion of humanity across stars, and yet in its seeming perfection, small inconsistencies began to emerge, not in the shape of open rebellion, nor in the loss of fleets, but in subtler ways, a hesitation in command, a pause in compliance, a question unasked yet implied. These were shadows that moved quietly through the vast machinery of the Imperium, easily overlooked by those focused on expansion alone, but unmistakable to those who carried the weight of its oversight. The warrior entrusted with such responsibility perceived them with acute clarity. Every victory, every integrated system, every compliant world brought satisfaction, yet each also magnified the complexity of command. The more expansive the Imperium, the more delicate the maintenance of unity. Distance had become not merely physical, but conceptual. The Emperor's presence, once tangible through counsel and guidance, now existed mostly in the abstract, a luminous ideal communicated through decrees and encoded strategy rather than through direct instruction. Within the councils of the Primarchs, this reality was reflected. Debates, previously focused on tactical matters, now included philosophical considerations. How much autonomy could a sector possess without undermining cohesion? How could cultural variance be accommodated without compromising the Emperor's vision? Some voices pressed for uniformity, others advocated flexibility. These discussions, conducted in calm and reasoned tones, revealed the first fissures an instinctive certainty, a subtle recognition that the Crusade's outward momentum alone could not guarantee internal harmony. The warrior mediated each session with careful attention. He emphasized alignment rather than dominance, shared purpose rather than personal triumph. Yet even as he guided the discussion, he recognized that the legions themselves, each loyal yet independent, were capable of interpreting intent differently. Subtle divergence, harmless and isolated cases, could become significant when multiplied across countless systems. He did not dismiss this possibility. He anticipated it. At the frontier, subtle challenges also began to manifest. Certain rediscovered human worlds, previously eager for reintegration, displayed caution or hesitation in compliance. They did not resist overtly, but their leaders asked questions that carried implications of sovereignty and decision-making authority. Others, long isolated, possessed knowledge of technology rivaling early imperial standards. Integration required delicacy, diplomacy coupled with demonstration of strength, judgment tempered by experience. Force alone could achieve obedience, persuasion achieved loyalty. The warrior navigated these circumstances with a practiced hand. He dispatched envoys alongside measured military presence, ensuring compliance while minimizing unnecessary devastation. Reconstruction and support followed immediately after engagement, fostering perception of the Imperium not as conqueror alone but as stabilizer, unifier, and guarantor of survival. Each success in these endeavors reinforced cohesion, yet also reminded him that loyalty, like trust, required maintenance and attentiveness. Meanwhile, the Imperium, the warp through which the Crusade traversed, exhibited patterns that, though imperceptible to ordinary fleets, were noted by veteran navigators and astropaths. Corridors shifted unpredictably. Fluctuations appeared without precedent. Choirs reported subtle disturbances during long-range transmissions, impressions of agitation or pressure that defied empirical measurement. Individually, these phenomena were insufficient to impede progress, yet collectively they formed a pattern, a whispering current beneath the surface of the Crusade's apparent order. The Mechanicum catalogued and analyzed these anomalies rigorously. No explanation was definitive. Statistical variance was acknowledged, yet no underlying causality could be isolated. The warrior incorporated these assessments into his planning, additional relay stations, contingency reserves, and rotational deployment of experienced crews. Preparation would counter uncertainty. Foresight would preserve stability. Even as the Crusade's outward successes continued, victories won, worlds integrated, trade networks expanded, the awareness of subtle dissonance shaped the warrior's decisions. Unity was no longer guaranteed by conquest alone. It required constant reaffirmation. Brotherhood among Primarchs, while intact, demanded conscious reinforcement through shared campaigns and communication. Command hierarchies were reviewed meticulously, ensuring that interpretation of authority and doctrine remained aligned across vast distances. Amid these pressures, isolated instances of philosophical friction emerged. A Primarch expressed concern over the degree of latitude granted to planetary governors, suggesting that even minor deviation could propagate risk. Another emphasized the necessity of patience, insisting that humans whose loyalty was hesitant should be nurtured rather than coerced. The warrior did not adjudicate with preference but synthesized solutions, protocols that balanced discipline with flexibility, uniformity with localized adaptation. These measures preserved harmony while acknowledging the nuanced reality of command. On distant frontier worlds, human populations displayed both resilience and reluctance. Their history of isolation had bred independent thought, sometimes conflicting with imperial orthodoxy. Where direct confrontation had been unnecessary in earlier stages of the Crusade, it now became consideration, albeit rarely employed. Negotiation, demonstration of strength, and immediate stabilization followed as standard practice. Through this, the Imperium advanced without provoking unnecessary unrest, yet every encounter reinforced a lesson that loyalty must be maintained consciously, not assumed as inherent. In private reflection, the warrior considered the enormity of his role. He bore the Emperor's trust not simply in overseeing fleets or legions, but in safeguarding the cohesion of an empire spanning light years. Each decision carried cascading consequence. Each choice, amplified across sectors and systems, could influence the very stability of the Imperium. He did not falter, he did not doubt. Instead, he calibrated, prepared, and acted with measured consistency. The stars beyond his flagship shimmered with indifferent brilliance. Systems, previously unknown and now integrated, stretched across the void, luminous yet fragile. The human race had achieved reunification in ways previously thought impossible, yet with every extension of its reach, the necessity for vigilance increased. The Crusade's victories, brilliant and decisive, carried within them the seeds of subtle strain, divergence of perspective, divergence of priority, divergence of interpretation. And beneath it all, currents of uncertainty whispered. They were faint, barely perceptible, yet undeniable, like distant echoes gathering momentum within the Imperium itself. The warrior observed, acknowledged, and prepared. He understood that vigilance and foresight would be as crucial to the Imperium's survival as valor in battle. The Great Crusade advanced onward, brilliant and disciplined, yet poised upon the threshold of subtle divergence. In the quiet vastness of space, beneath the indifferent light of distant stars, humanity moved forward, luminous, unified, and unaware of the whispering shadows gathering beyond sight, waiting to test the bonds of allegiance and the endurance of its own certainty. By the time the Great Crusade reached what would later be regarded as its mature phase, the Imperium had become a complex organism whose size and scope rivaled imagination itself. Worlds reclaimed from isolation numbered in the thousands, Fleets traversed corridors of the warp with precision born of decades of practice. Entire sectors had been folded into a singular vision that sought not only to unify humanity, but to elevate it above the chaos that had threatened its survival for millennia. Yet with this vastness came the quiet weight of omniscience, the responsibility to see, understand, and direct across scales beyond ordinary comprehension. The warrior entrusted with this authority carried that burden deliberately and with full awareness. Each decision, each allocation of force, each administrative edict had consequences magnified across hundreds of systems. A misjudgment of supply distribution might starve a planetary defense contingent light years from the point of calculation. An oversight in astropathic coordination could delay communication for weeks, leaving sectors without guidance in a medium governed by currents both predictable and capricious. The Imperium had become an organism whose parts were in constant motion, yet whose survival depended upon the coherence of every motion. In council with the Primarchs, discussions reflected this complexity. They no longer debated conquest alone. Their deliberations had expanded to encompass stability, governance, and foresight. Some advocated rapid assimilation of newly discovered worlds, believing that speed would suppress uncertainty and preempt external threat. Others cautioned that overextension risked fracturing attention, leaving gaps of misinterpretation, for error or for resistance to flourish in the silence of distance. These debates were conducted with the utmost decorum, yet each contained an undercurrent of unease, an acknowledgement that even in loyalty, differences of approach could subtly challenge uniformity of outcome. The warrior, as always, mediated with precision. He neither imposed unilateral decisions nor deferred excessively. Instead, he synthesized recommendations into strategies that balanced immediacy with patience, discipline with adaptability, central authority with local oversight. Redundancy was built into every system. Fleets were rotated, supply chains reinforced, and astropathic choirs augmented to maintain psychic clarity across long transmissions. Every effort sought to transform uncertainty into manageable variables rather than allow it to accumulate into risk. Even beyond human compliance, the outer edges of the Crusade presented anomalies that required attention. Certain alien civilizations, long hidden in sectors considered unexplored, demonstrated withdrawal rather than engagement, abandoning trade routes and fortified positions with careful calculation. Their motives were obscure. Some acted out of fear, others out of strategy, and some perhaps merely observed the human advance to gauge its intentions. The warrior responded with cautious observation, deploying reconnaissance alongside selected deterrent positioning, ensuring that intelligence preceded engagement. Understanding, he recognized, was as vital to survival as strength. Warp currents, too, offered challenges beyond the ordinary. Patterns of fluctuation became increasingly evident in long-range corridors, with navigators reporting subtle constriction or displacement of passage that defied previous experience. Astropathic choirs described impressions of vegetation without origin, fleeting echoes within the immaterial that could neither be fully interpreted nor fully measured. These were phenomena to respect, not panic over, yet they reminded the warrior that the universe was vast, unpredictable, and unconcerned with human intention. On newly reintegrated human worlds, philosophical divergence began to manifest more frequently. Some populations questioned the necessity of centralized authority, arguing for local decision-making within the larger framework of imperial compliance. Others, accustomed to prolonged isolation, hesitated to adopt the Imperium's administrative rigor, fearing the erosion of their own culture and agency. These challenges were not crises, but they required diplomacy as refined as any battlefield tactic. Envoys, military advisors, and remembrances coordinated to convey both the necessity and the benevolence of integration. Success was measured not solely in obedience, but in alignment of conviction. Within this dynamic, the Primarchs themselves exhibited subtle variation in interpretation of duty. Some emphasized strict doctrinal adherence, others favored local adaptation, and a few wrestled with questions of recognition and honor within the expanding hierarchy. The warrior, observing these tendencies, ensured that communication and joint operations reinforce alignment without diminishing the strengths of individual leadership. Harmony required constant attention. Loyalty alone was insufficient when distance magnified difference. In moments of solitary reflection, aboard the bridge of his flagship or within the quiet chambers of command, the warrior contemplated the magnitude of his role. He bore responsibility not merely for fleets, legions, all worlds, but for the integrity of an empire stretching across thousands of light years. Each decision carried ramifications beyond immediate comprehension, yet he met the burden with composed resolve. Vigilance, foresight, and careful orchestration were the tools by which the Imperium's continuity was ensured. The stars themselves, indifferent and eternal, offered neither counsel nor warning. They were constant observers, their silent light indifferent to the successes, challenges, or philosophies of humankind. And yet, within that indifferent expanse, the Imperium pressed forward, luminous, disciplined, and confident, its achievements undeniable, its unity remarkable, but its maintenance dependent upon tireless oversight. Below the surface of conquest and compliance, subtle currents of uncertainty continued to gather. They were not yet manifest as rebellion or failure, but their presence was perceptible to those attuned to the scale of oversight. Each fluctuation in the warp, each hesitant leader, each philosophical divergence formed part of a wider pattern, delicate and imperceptible to all but the most vigilant. The warrior did not fear this. He recognized it as inherent to the scale and ambition of the crusade. Vigilance would transform potential disruption into manageable complexity. Preparation would safeguard unity. Awareness would preserve the Emperor's vision. And so, as fleets prepared to translate into distant sectors, as legions stood ready in the vacuum of space, and as human worlds renewed their integration with disciplined fervor, the Imperium advanced onward. Its brilliance remained unchallenged, yet the whisper of unseen currents persisted, quiet, subtle, and inexorable, a reminder that even in moments of apparent perfection, the burden of omniscience must never be neglected, for the stability of the galaxy rested upon watchful eyes and measured hands. The Great Crusade, by now, had traversed countless light years, stitching together a vast tapestry of human civilization that had been scattered for millennia. The Imperium's reach extended from well-known core systems to the furthest fringes of settled space. Every reclaimed world represented not merely conquest, but a convergence of histories, cultures, and aspirations. Yet, for all the outward appearance of order and unity, the warrior who bore the Emperor's confidence recognized that the subtle currents of unease had begun to take shape. They were not storms, not crises, but quiet forces that pressed at the boundaries of command and perception. In council with the Primarchs, discussions had grown increasingly nuanced. No longer did deliberations revolve solely around the speed of expansion or the tactics of compliance. Now, they examined governance, cultural integration, and the balance between autonomy and uniformity. Some brothers insisted that rigid application of imperial truth was essential, that deviation could threaten cohesion in ways unseen. Others advocated flexibility, arguing that the human spirit, long nurtured in isolation, required room to adapt and flourish under the Imperium's protection. These debates were conducted without overt tension, yet each carried the weight of implication. That unity, while absolute in principle, might be fragile in practice. The warrior listened with unwavering patience, synthesizing perspectives and guiding discourse toward decisions that preserved alignment without suppressing individuality. He recognized that loyalty alone could not sustain the Imperium at this scale. Each Primarch's interpretation of duty, each governor's execution of policy, each citizen's understanding of the Emperor's purpose contributed to a network whose stability depended upon careful cultivation. Even minor divergence, multiplied across light years, could accumulate into subtle destabilization. At the frontier, the Imperium's operations were challenged not by overt hostility, but by complexity. Some human societies, rediscovered after centuries of isolation, exhibited technological development and organizational sophistication rivaling early imperial worlds. They did not resist conquest violently, yet they questioned the necessity of centralized authority. Their hesitation demanded both demonstration of strength and the subtler art of persuasion. Military precision alone would secure compliance. Diplomacy, patience, and negotiation would secure alignment of purpose. The warrior directed both, balancing force and guidance to achieve outcomes that reinforced unity while preserving loyalty. Warp anomalies had grown more frequent and pronounced. Navigators reported passages in which currents shifted unexpectedly, generating delays or forcing reroutes. Astropathic choirs described impressions of pressure, agitation, and subtle distortion in psychic resonance. These disturbances were insufficient to halt campaigns, yet they introduced layers of uncertainty into the Crusade's operations. The Mechanicum catalogued, analyzed, and recommended mitigations, yet explanation remained elusive. To the warrior, these fluctuations were neither threat nor omen, but a reminder of the universe's indifference and the necessity of preparation and vigilance in the face of uncertainty. Within the legions, subtle variation in conduct and interpretation became increasingly evident. Some Primarchs emphasized strict doctrinal adherence, focusing on absolute clarity in reporting and execution. Others permitted greater latitude in implementation, trusting the judgment of subordinate commanders and local leaders. The warrior did not confront these differences as conflict. He guided them, ensuring that each approach ultimately reinforced cohesion. Alignment of intent, rather than uniformity of method, became the guiding principle of oversight. Even among compliant worlds, philosophical friction occasionally surfaced. Leaders asked questions of sovereignty, cultural preservation, and autonomy. These inquiries were not insubordination. They were the natural consequences of centuries of independent development. The warrior addressed each case with deliberate attention, reinforcing the narrative of shared destiny, survival, and progress while respecting the integrity of local systems. Compliance was not imposed solely through demonstration of power. It was cultivated through understanding, respect, and the articulation of a unified purpose. In quieter moments, aboard the flagship that served as a seat of command, the warrior contemplated the scale of the task he bore. The Imperium was immense, luminous, and disciplined, yet its vastness introduced vulnerability. He was tasked with observing, guiding, and maintaining cohesion across countless systems, fleets, and individuals, each acting with loyalty yet each capable of interpreting purpose differently. Vigilance, foresight, and coordination were the tools that preserved continuity. No battle would ever test the Imperium more than the subtle strains that grew imperceptibly across distance, culture, and command. The Emperor remained on Terra, radiant and distant, a guiding presence whose authority was absolute yet whose direct oversight of frontier operations was necessarily limited. The warrior did not perceive this as weakness. He understood that the Emperor's vision was both the foundation and the boundary of the Crusade's purpose. It was brilliant, coherent, and immovable, yet its preservation required constant attention, adjustment, and stewardship. Beyond human endeavors, the outer reaches of explored space revealed signs of alien observation. Certain xeno-civilizations withdrew in precise calculation, abandoning installations and trade corridors to allow the Imperium to expand unimpeded, yet leaving evidence of careful scrutiny. These actions were neither aggression nor invitation. They were the quiet calculations of beings observing an emerging force whose trajectory was not fully understood. The warrior accounted for these patterns, positioning reconnaissance and monitoring forces to anticipate rather than react. Knowledge, in this case, was as valuable as any weapon. Amid these pressures, the Imperium continued to advance. Fleets translated into the warp, legions executed campaigns with unwavering precision, and human worlds integrated into a cohesive system. Victory was outwardly assured, yet the warrior perceived the delicate tension beneath this brilliance. The currents of subtle divergence, philosophical, logistical, psychic, moved quietly, almost imperceptibly, accumulating like distant clouds on a horizon otherwise illuminated by the Imperium's radiance. He did not fear this. He prepared. He observed. He calibrated every mechanism of command, every chain of communication, and every element of governance to ensure that the unity achieved through decades of crusade would endure. And in the quiet of his observation chamber, gazing into the depthless expanse of stars, he allowed himself a single recognition. The Imperium had never been simply a machine of conquest. It was a living, intricate organism. Its brilliance was matched only by its fragility, beyond perception of most. Beneath the victories and ceremonies, the edge of unease was gathering. It moved slowly, silently, and inevitably. Yet, as always, the warrior remained vigilant. The Great Crusade advanced onward, radiant and disciplined, across light years and centuries of human history, luminous and orderly. And beneath its brilliance, the whisper of subtle currents persisted, quiet, patient, inexorable, a reminder that even the greatest unity must be nurtured, and that the stability of the galaxy rested upon watchful eyes and deliberate hands. By this point in the Great Crusade, the Imperium had expanded to a scale that defied comprehension. Thousands of human worlds had been brought into compliance, each with its own culture, its own history, and its own understanding of survival. Fleets traversed a void with practiced regularity, translating into warp corridors that spanned systems previously unconnected for millennia. Legions operated in synchrony, their campaigns choreographed across distances that would challenge any ordinary mind to fully grasp. And yet, for the warrior entrusted with oversight, the outward appearance of order concealed a truth far subtle and far more demanding. The Imperium required constant vigilance, for unity, once achieved, could not be assumed attainable. The Emperor remained upon Terra, radiant and distant, a focal point of authority and purpose. His guidance persisted in decrees, in the transmission of strategy, and in the silent alignment of the legions, yet his physical absence necessitated reliance upon intermediaries and subordinates. The warrior recognized that this distance, though necessary, introduced complexity. Decisions made at the edges of imperial space, while loyal in intent, could diverge in interpretation. Every action, every report, every judgment became a variable within a network whose stability depended upon coordination, foresight, and discipline. In councils with the Primarchs, discussions reflected the scale and subtlety of this responsibility. Tactical considerations were still examined, the disposition of forces, the timing of engagement, the management of logistics, but now these deliberations were intertwined with philosophical and strategic concerns. Some Primarchs argue for rapid assimilation of newly encountered human civilizations, asserting that delay allowed uncertainty to fester. Others emphasize patient integration, suggesting that loyalty was more reliably cultivated than demanded, and that the preservation of local culture could reinforce the Imperium's legitimacy. The warrior synthesized these perspectives, ensuring that alignment of purpose remained paramount even as methods varied. Yet even within the harmonious structure of the legions, small divergences began to appear. Variations in doctrine, emphasis, and interpretation emerged not from malice or defiance, but from a necessary autonomy of commanders stationed far from terror. Some emphasized rigid adherence to procedure, others sought adaptive application of imperial law. These distinctions, though minor individually, carried potential for compounding effects when multiplied across hundreds of worlds and thousands of personnel. The warrior observed carefully, reinforcing coherence without erasing individuality, understanding that true strength lay in the disciplined coordination of difference rather than its suppression. At the frontier, subtle challenges emerged among human populations. Isolated worlds, rediscovered after centuries of drift, displayed technological sophistication and societal complexity equal to early imperial development. Many were eager to integrate, yet some questioned the necessity of centralized authority or the preservation of local governance. Compliance was not guaranteed by fleet power alone. It required diplomacy, persuasion, and demonstration of the Imperium's broader purpose. Envoys traveled alongside military advisors, and reconstruction efforts followed combat or negotiation with meticulous timing, reinforcing perception of unity as both just and enduring. The Imperium itself, the warp, grew increasingly capricious. Navigators reported corridors where currents shifted unexpectedly, delaying fleet movements or requiring rerouting. Astropathic choirs described fleeting impressions of vegetation, subtle and indistinct, as though the fabric of the warp were whispering of pressures beyond mortal understanding. These disturbances were insufficient to halt the crusade, yet they introduced a layer of latent uncertainty. The Mechanicum catalogued each anomaly, proposing redundancies, relay stations, and reserve contingents. No single variable could halt expansion, but the warrior understood that the accumulation of unobserved factors could have consequences far removed from the site of their origin. Among legions and governors, the warrior reinforced procedural and doctrinal alignment. Lines of authority were clarified. Succession protocols were codified. Rotational oversight prevented insularity and maintained a cohesion of operational perspective. Regular communication with Primarchs reinforced understanding of shared purpose, ensuring that leadership, though dispersed, operated under consistent vision. Every decision, every correspondence, every inspection contributed to a web of oversight that, while invisible to most, was crucial to the continued stability of the Imperium. Beyond human governance, distant alien civilizations observed the expansion of humanity. Certain species withdrew without confrontation, abandoning installations or trade routes, their calculations deliberate and inscrutable. These actions required careful monitoring, for they were neither hostile nor benign. They were simply measured, patient observation. The warrior accounted for these presences with reconnaissance and strategic positioning, ensuring that intelligence preceded engagement. Knowledge, as ever, was as vital to maintaining stability as fleets or weaponry. Amid these challenges, successes continued to reinforce perception and reality. Worlds integrated seamlessly, fleets executed precise operations, and the legions upheld discipline across space and time. The outward appearance of the Crusade remained brilliant and orderly, yet in the private quarters of his flagship, the warrior reflected upon the subtle pressures beneath that brilliance. Currents of divergence, philosophical, operational, and logistical, moved quietly through the network of the Imperium, gathering at edges and nodes where vigilance was most required. He did not fear these currents. He anticipated them. He acted to ensure their containment. Vigilance, foresight, and discipline were the tools that preserved the Emperor's vision. Each measure implemented, each rotation of forces, each inspection of procedure was a deliberate act of stewardship. The Imperium's unity, though luminous and formidable, depended upon constant attention, for even the smallest misalignment could ripple outward across the vast expanse of human domains. As he gazed upon the stars from his observation deck, he allowed a brief moment of reflection. Light years of human worlds stretched across the void, brilliant yet fragile. The Imperium's victories shone like embers in darkness, yet the responsibility of maintaining them rested entirely upon those entrusted with command. Beyond the reach of immediate perception, subtle shadows gathered, distant, quiet, inexorable. The Great Crusade advanced onward, luminous and disciplined, yet poised perpetually upon the knife edge of unforeseen pressures. And in that edge, the warrior remained vigilant, understanding that the Imperium's survival relied not only on conquest, but upon the weight of attention, the rigor of preparation, and the patient cultivation of unity across an indifferent galaxy. The Great Crusade, now decades in motion, had achieved a scale that surpassed the dreams of the earliest architects of human unification. Entire sectors of space, once isolated and fragmented, had been folded into the Imperium with methodical precision. Fleet formations stretched across thousands of light-years, their engines tracing arcs of calculated geometry through the warp. Legions advanced with synchronized purpose, not merely to conquer, but to integrate, to stabilize, and to prepare humanity for a future in which survival depended upon unity rather than chance. And yet, for the warrior entrusted with the Emperor's mandate, every achievement carried within it the latent reminder that scale alone did not guarantee permanence. His vigilance had become second nature, an instinct sharpened over campaigns that spanned worlds and systems alike. Each decision, whether the distribution of supplies, the positioning of fleets, or the coordination of astropathic networks, had ramifications magnified across the Imperium. A minor oversight in one sector could propagate unforeseen consequences in another, light years distant. Even victories demanded attention, for triumph could conceal subtle divergences, and the absence of immediate threat did not equate to stability. The weight of omniscience was immense, and the warrior bore it with deliberate calm, neither succumbing to anxiety nor dismissing its quiet pressures. In councils with the Primarchs, deliberations had become as much about philosophy as strategy. Some spoke of the necessity of doctrinal uniformity, arguing that absolute adherence would prevent fragmentation in distant systems. Others advocated flexibility, emphasizing that humans, long accustomed to isolation, required measured adaptation to imperial norms. The warrior mediated these discussions with steady authority, ensuring that the unity of purpose remained intact even as methods varied. He understood that cohesion depended upon both clarity of intent and allowance for operational discretion. The Imperium's strength was a balance of alignment and autonomy. At the frontier, human civilizations continued to present nuanced challenges. Many welcomed integration, yet some displayed hesitation, posing questions about local governance, cultural preservation, and autonomy. These inquiries were not defiance, but consequence of isolation, centuries of independent thought shaped by survival. The warrior approached each situation with measured judgment, deploying envoys alongside calibrated military presence, and following action with immediate reconstruction and support. Compliance was achieved, not merely through demonstration of power, but through the cultivation of shared understanding, loyalty, and recognition of the Imperium's broader purpose. The warp, as ever, remained an unpredictable medium. Navigators reported corridors of subtle turbulence, passages where currents shifted without pattern, delaying fleet movements and complicating coordination. Astropathic choirs conveyed impressions of strain within the Imperium, faint yet persistent. The Mechanicum catalogued each anomaly, proposing redundancies, secondary relay stations, and reserve contingents. No single anomaly threatened the Crusade's momentum, yet the accumulation of disturbances reminded the warrior that the universe was indifferent and that preparation and foresight were the true shields of order. Within the legions, subtle differences in interpretation became increasingly evident. Some Primarchs emphasized doctrinal rigidity, others allowed adaptive strategies for local circumstances. The warrior encouraged collaboration and exchange, rotating legions through shared operations to prevent insularity and maintain coherence. He understood that minor divergence, if unobserved or unaddressed, could ripple outward, amplifying across light years to produce misalignment in philosophy, administration, or loyalty. Every council, every mission, every report became a mechanism for reinforcing alignment across the Imperium's dispersed networks. Observing distant xeno-civilizations, he noted calculated withdrawal rather than engagement. Certain species abandoned installations and trade routes, leaving the Imperium's advance unimpeded. Yet watching closely, analyzing the expansion and timing of campaigns. Their motives were inscrutable. The warrior accounted for these presences with reconnaissance and strategic positioning, ensuring that observation remained informative without risking confrontation. Knowledge, he understood, was a weapon as decisive as any legionary or voidcraft, and observation was as essential as deployment. Even as victories accumulated in human worlds integrated successfully, subtle currents of unease persisted. Philosophical divergence, logistical strain, and the unpredictability of the warp contributed to tensions that were imperceptible to all but the most vigilant. These currents were quiet, almost imperceptible, yet inexorably present, reminders that the Imperium's cohesion was not a natural state but a condition constantly maintained through effort, attention, and deliberate action. In private reflection, the warrior contemplated the vast web of influence under his supervision. Light years of worlds, millions of souls, and thousands of legions formed a network that, while luminous and disciplined, remained delicately balanced. Every decision, every inspection, every rotation of command contributed to a system whose stability relied upon observation and foresight. Victory alone could not secure continuity. Understanding and vigilance were equally indispensable. The Emperor's presence on Terra remained the guiding force of the Imperium, radiant, distant, and absolute. Yet the practical realization of his vision depended upon the exercise of judgment and care by those at the edges of the crusade, and nowhere more so than the warrior entrusted with stewardship. Every successful campaign reinforced the credibility of imperial authority, yet each added system increased the scope of responsibility. He bore this weight without complaint, aware that every measured action preserved the coherence of the Emperor's grand design. As the flagship drifted in the void, surrounded by distant suns and the shimmer of warp currents, he observed the Imperium in its entirety. Brilliant, expansive, and disciplined, it stretched across the darkness like a constellation of human purpose. And beneath its radiance, subtle tensions gathered at the edges of perception, the faint stirrings of divergence, the quiet movement of uncertainty, the invisible currents that could, if neglected, test the resilience of unity. He did not fear these currents. He met them with vigilance. Preparation, oversight, and careful cultivation of alignment were the instruments by which the Imperium endured. Triumphs were celebrated, yet awareness never lapsed. Even as the crusade advanced with brilliance and precision, the warrior understood that the true challenge of command was not the victory of battle, but the preservation of order across a galaxy indifferent to human endeavor. The Great Crusade pressed onward, luminous and disciplined, yet poised forever upon the knife edge of subtle pressures and latent divergence. And in the quiet of observation, the warrior remained watchful, a sentinel of purpose and continuity, understanding that the survival of the Imperium depended upon tireless care, deliberate action, and the unbroken exercise of vigilance across the endless horizon of stars.